Good afternoon. We're going to move to the next phase of our program for today, which is our keynote presentation. Those of you who were here on yesterday know that we received a little bit of history about the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and also with the proclamation that our mayor presented early today. He talked about the history of the Fair Housing Act. We also know, in reflecting on that history, that the act came about after years of protest, years of civil unrest in this country, years of warriors standing up for justice. Without the sacrifice of leaders such as Dr. King, who gave his life so that we could all enjoy the freedoms that are guaranteed in the United States Constitution, we cannot celebrate a day like today without reflecting on the sacrifices that were made. We cannot take for granted the freedoms, the liberties that we enjoy today. So I have the privilege today of introducing someone who is a person who stands up and fights for the values that are reflected in the Fair Housing Act in our U.S. Constitution. We all know that we had the U.S. Constitution, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1866, we had so many different laws that were supposed to guarantee freedom and to allow people to have the protections that were guaranteed under these various laws. What history has shown us is if we don't have people who are willing to represent us and fight our battles for us, then a lot of the laws just become something that's written on paper but not enforced. So I especially would like to thank Mr. Colfax, because with the talent and everything he has, he could be making millions of dollars doing corporate litigation or some other type of law, but he has chosen to be an advocate in civil rights, to stand up for the rights. And so I just want to give him an applause for that. Also, some of you went with us on a tour yesterday of one of the communities in Austin, the Colony Park area, which is about to be redeveloped by the city of Austin. And those of you who were on the tour and had an opportunity to talk to some of the elders, you heard about some of their concerns about the lack of resources in their community, how they felt like they had been neglected by different governmental entities, and how they were suffering from the impact of the neglect that they have been experiencing over the decades. And so for the people that were on the tour, we have a treat today because Mr. Colfax is going to talk to us about some remedies that have been used in the past and that are available for communities of color that have been neglected. So without further ado, I would like to present to you Attorney Reed Colfax.
Thank you, Beverly. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to be here celebrating Fair Housing Month with all of you. You know, you all could be making millions too if you wanted to serve the interests of corporate America, but the fact that you're here celebrating Fair Housing Month tells me that you've decided to do something a bit more productive with your lives and advocate to make a more just and equitable society. And we've come a long way since 1968, but as all of you know, we've got a long way to go. In your program, you may have seen that the title of my presentation here as being Remedies for Historic Discrimination and Segregation. Well, I decided to drop the historic. Because, sure, discrimination and segregation has been a central part of American history, but it's part of our present, and unfortunately, it's going to be part of our future for a while. I do have hope that at some day we will be able to end discrimination and segregation, but it's certainly not going to be anything that happens immediately. There are strong forces that want to preserve and perpetuate discrimination and segregation in this country. But today I want to talk about some tools and remedies we have to ameliorate or limit the effects of discrimination and segregation. I'm not naive enough to suggest we can end discrimination and segregation, but surely we can minimize it. I aim to tell a couple hopeful stories to show how we can use these stories we have and use these tools we have to address discrimination and segregation. And I'm going to do that by talking through two recent cases where we had to creatively use the power of the fair housing laws to stop and then turn around some very destructive discriminatory practices. First, let me make sure we are all on the same page about segregation and discrimination today. So we know segregation persists in this country. Right? It is a persistent, obstinate force that's fed by a system that is not going away anytime soon. Candy earlier mentioned Color of Law. Yes, definitely read it. Extraordinary book. It talks about one of many factors that lead to discrimination and segregation in our country. It talks about the role of the government, private individuals, private companies. There are so many, many forces that feed this machine of discrimination. Now, I'm not going to get into the causes or why it perpetuates segregation today, but for this discussion, know that it exists, and segregation allows for discrimination against communities of color, even without intent or without malice. You know, when Candy was talking about how she doesn't see color, right? She goes into a house, goes into a community and doesn't see color. Maybe that's true. And maybe there are appraisers that operate in that way and don't see color. But even if that is true, they're still operating in a system that is segregated, where black neighborhoods are devalued, neighborhoods where Latinx people live are devalued. So when they're assessing what's the value of this home, color and race and ethnicity are present, regardless if they believe they are colorblind. The history and the system of segregation is present. So as a result, you can take purely neutral, seemingly benign actions, and when placed on this historic and systemic racism, they can have a significant discriminatory effect. Now, you all know this, right? Working in housing every day. But let me walk through some of the factors or the facts that we know about discrimination. Right? Today, segregation of whites from blacks remains the highest of any two racial groups in America. Right? That's been true for a long time. Segregation from whites from Hispanics and whites from Asians has actually increased over the last few decades. there's this index called the dissimilarity index that measures how many people of a particular race would have to move in order to have even distribution of that race in a community. 57% of black residents would have to move to another community in order to have what we could call full integration. Over half of black residents in the country live in those sorts of segregated neighborhoods. And I always think looking at schools is so important. We know opportunity is a critical aspect when you think about an educational opportunity, when you think about life outcomes and likely outcomes. So I always look at schools, and it's amazing that white-black segregation in schools has actually increased over the last few decades. Yes, we are making advances. We're making advances in housing. We're making advances in jobs. Schools, we're still going the wrong direction. Same with white-Hispanic segregation. Let me just show you some pictures of segregation. So this map has the colors that show high levels of segregation in red and what this analysis considered integrated counties or metropolitan areas in blue. You gotta sort of squint your eyes to see the blue. There are about 30 counties or metropolitan areas in the entire United States that are considered integrated. And you see that red, right? Hundreds of highly segregated counties and metropolitan areas still in the United States. Then if you look at cities, right? New York City, what's the phrase, the poem, give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. Yes, and I'll take them and I'll sort them by race and ethnicity and put them into neighborhoods based on their race and ethnicity. Blue dots, those are black people. Green dots are white people. Orange, Latinx people. And red, Asian people. As you can see, this is New York City. There are clearly defined racial and ethnic neighborhoods. You can go anywhere in the country. Chicago, same exact scenario. This is not 1950, this is not 1960, this is 2020 data. Oftentimes, don't put Dallas in my slides, but here we are, not too far from Dallas. Much more spread out. Welcome to Texas, right? But same thing, right? You can still see those segregated patterns. All right, so we've got segregation in the United States. We also have discrimination, right? Discrimination continues in the United States today. So this is from the National Fair Housing Alliance, Fair Housing Trends. They do it every year. It talks about various trends they're seeing in housing discrimination around the country. And one of the things it does is lists off the number of complaints received by FIPS, FAPS, DOJ, HUD, and so forth. So this is 2022 data, 33,000 complaints of housing discrimination. And that is such a small percentage of how much housing discrimination there actually is. HUD estimated back in, I think it was 2000, that something like 22% of every housing transaction with a black person has discrimination in it. 26% of every housing transaction, rental housing transaction with a Latinx person, discrimination. So there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of incidents of discrimination in housing every single day. All right, so segregation is a reality in this country. Discrimination is a reality in this country. What can be done about it? So I'm going to talk about two cases. First, Sapelo Island in McIntosh County, Georgia, where we challenged discrimination in the provision of municipal services and in taxes. And then NAFA, National Fair Housing Alliance, and a number of fair housing organizations versus Fannie Mae, involving discrimination in the maintenance and marketing of real estate-owned properties. So starting with Sapelo. So Sapelo Island is this little barrier island off the coast of Georgia that was originally, indigenous folks were there for centuries. And then an individual named Thomas Spalding came in, took over, and had a plantation. Cotton and sugar, had a host of enslaved people, and did what they did throughout the South. Civil War comes. Spalding and his ancestors are kicked off the island, and the formerly enslaved people, using mechanisms like the Freedoms Bureau, money they had saved, resources they had saved, they bought land, created their own communities, and had a thriving economy on Sapelo Island. So things go well for decades. And then a guy named Howard Coffin, he invented the Hudson, or developed the Hudson automobile. So he's an automobile magnate, huge amount of money. He finds Sapelo Island and says, oh, this place is wonderful, I love it. And he makes it as essentially his playground. So over the next decades, from the turn of the century in the 1900s, over the next decades, he buys up a lot of property. And then R.J. Reynolds, of tobacco fame, he thinks the same thing. Oh, I love this place. I'm going to make this a little bit of a playground for the rich and the famous. Presidents come down and so forth. So he comes on this island. This is the original, this picture here is the original plantation. It's still there. That picture is from about a year ago. And what R.J. Reynolds does is he steals the land. Right? So all of this land that is owned by, call themselves the Gullah Geechee, so formerly enslaved people on the island, all of this land they owned, he essentially steals. He does it through coercion. He maintained all the jobs on the island. So you either swap land for this nice parcel you have of 10 acres for a half acre of the swamp land, or I'm not going to let you have a job on the island. He controlled the ferry, right? The only way to get on and off the island. Same thing. Sell me your land for this ridiculously low price, or I'm not going to let you use the ferry. And then he just stole it through fraud. There are hundreds of examples of these sorts of deeds. This is one of them. I think you can probably see it. So on the top, this is a transfer of land from a Gullah Geechee descendant to R.J. Reynolds. Gertie Sams Grosvenor up there. If you can read that in the middle, there's an X, and it says her mark. So she had marked it with an X, supposedly, and somebody else had written her name on either side. 6 months later, here's Gertrude Grosvenor, same person, supposedly signing it with her full name. Right? They just made it up. Gertrude Grosvenor, who supposedly signed with an X, school teacher, right? Unlikely to have been illiterate. And I am no handwriting expert, but don't these other names look like they're all signed by the same hand? So that's how it worked. Through the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, this land that is being cultivated by the Gullah Geechee that they had worked for years and years and years was just stolen, and the entirety of the community is pushed into this one small area, marshy area in the land called Hog Hammock. So that's in the 1950s to about 2000. So a small population now, descendants of formerly enslaved people in this one small area of the island, trying to create their own economy, have their own community. And then other developers come in and say, oh, this would be a great place to have a summer home. So I don't know how many of you know it, but places like Hilton Head, which we know now is Vacation Home Central, used to be a Gullah Geechee community entirely. It's gone. It's completely wiped out. Same exact story as Hilton Head, as Sapelo Island. So all up and down the East Coast, this was happening. So on Sapelo Island, it doesn't happen until the sort of mid-2000s, around 2011, 2012, and these big mansions are starting to go up as vacation homes. But a lot of the Gullah Geechee descendants are holding on to their property. So what does the county do? They hike property taxes. And when I tell you they hike property taxes, it's mind-boggling. These are the fair market values of about 18 or so properties from 2011 to 2013. So for those of you maybe back in the back can't see, first one at the top, fair market value of an undeveloped half-acre lot in 2011 was $5,000. So that's what your property taxes were calculated off of, $5,000. 2013, 2 years later, $296,495. 5,000, yes, that is rude. 5,000% increase, right? So what happens? So you have there's barely an economy on Sapelo Island. Many people are on fixed incomes. You get a tax hike like this, there's nothing you can do. You have two options. You either sell your property, developer comes in, buys it up, puts up their nice vacation home, or you don't pay your taxes, and in a year or so, it's up for tax sale. Same thing happens, developer comes in and buys it. Only difference is the developer probably pays less. So that's the taxes. So that's when we get a call at the firm and they say, hey, we're getting driven off the island. We've seen you've done cases like this. Can you help? It's actually a little unusual for us. We actually had never dealt with the taxes being used, even though it happens a lot, as the vehicle of discrimination. And so we ended up in Georgia State Court, which is an interesting experience, describing all of the flaws and everything was wrong with this reevaluation appraisal process that took a property that was worth $5,000 and took it up to $300,000 over the course of a year. And we're actually fairly successful because they didn't think anybody was going to challenge them. Right? And they had done such a bad job, it was fairly easy to say, this is completely off. And with those jumps being as high as they could, as they were, they said, all right, we've got to back off. So we ended up settling all of those tax cases and froze the property values to back at that 2011 value plus 25%. So instead of a 5,000% increase, there was a 25% increase. Frozen for a period of 3 years. That was back in 2015. They have not raised taxes since. It's coming. The reason they haven't raised taxes is this other case I'm going to talk about in a second, where we brought other discrimination claims. But it's only a matter of time before those taxes go up, and there's going to have to be some other solution to be able to maintain the property. So the other part of the case was the discrimination litigation. So the residents on Sapelo Island are paying these huge amounts in taxes, yet they're getting zero services. And when I say zero services, I really mean zero services. So the things you think about, roads are maintained, fire department will come when you call, EMS will come when you call, so on and so forth. None of that was happening on Sapelo Island. And the county would say, well, it's an island, it's hard for us to get there and do these things. Yeah, well, you're more than happy to take their taxes and give them nothing in return. So we brought a claim challenging that discrimination in services. We used some of the laws that Beverly mentioned. And they also included the ADA because the ferry, which was operated by the state, is totally inaccessible. So if you had a disability, the population on Sapelo is aging, so it's many of them did have disabilities. You basically couldn't use the ferry. So we filed this, and a theme that I always talk about is how all across the country, judges are cutting back on the protections that are supposedly there, the anti-discrimination laws, the Fair Housing Act, Equal Protection Clause, always getting cut back. And there was for a while in fair housing jurisprudence by courts this idea that this language in one of the provisions of the statute that says can't discriminate in the terms and the conditions in connection with the sale or rental of a dwelling. And so courts started reading that as like, oh, in connection with the sale or rental of the dwelling, that means you can only challenge discrimination when it happens at the moment of sale or rental. And that's what the judge here in Sapelo said. Oh, well, you're talking about services after the fact, after properties were bought decades, centuries ago. So you have no Fair Housing Act claim. And actually threw out our Fair Housing Act claim. So we had equal protection and Title VI to continue on, but threw it out. So always a theme to keep in mind of how judges will make sometimes fairly ridiculous interpretations of the law just to cut back the scope of the law. The 11th Circuit, which sits above the Southern District of Georgia where we were, never heard this case, but we had a very similar case where in the 11th Circuit said that is sort of interpretation of the moment and sale of rental is just wrong, and so that wouldn't hold up any longer. So we have these claims, litigate them for years, 6, 8 years, and eventually the state and then later the county settle them. And so to bring this up to sort of talk about this case, talking about remedies, okay, that the fair and talking about how the Fair Housing Act and fair housing laws can still be strong tools to create some pretty important remedies. So the settlement of the state, the claims against the state, first and perhaps most importantly, the state owns a ton of land on Sapelo Island. And what we got the state to agree to is that they would allow Gullah Geechee descendants some role in deciding how that state land would be used. So instead of being there's hunting that happens on the island where mostly whites come in and they have their little hunting parties and going around on the island. Instead of things like that, there hopefully are going to be cultural and historic preservation of the Gullah Geechee culture on the island. Water, the state was responsible for bringing water to the island. And so one of the parts of the settlement was improving the water systems, money of the plaintiffs, and then just a complete overhaul of the ferry and the docks, mostly to make it accessible. But one other issue that was out there is that the ferry was built around tourists. So the ferry schedule was built around tourists and built around some state employees who worked on the island. So if you were a family on the island, you basically no schools on the island. So you would have to go to the mainland for schools. But if you had a child, because of the ferry service, who was going to school on the mainland, basically couldn't do any after-school activities whatsoever, missed the ferry. And you miss the ferry, you're staying on the mainland, you're finding somewhere to stay on the mainland because there's no other way across. And so and the same with jobs. Okay, so if you lived on the island, you basically couldn't have, with the ferry schedule, you couldn't have a job on the mainland. So getting the ferry schedule change was really important. And then, of course, all of the money to go into improving the accessibility of the ferry. Oh. Wow. Well, what happened? I don't know what button I pushed. I'm no longer in control. So, which may be a good thing. So then there's also the settlement of the claims against the county. So the county had the responsibility, based on all of these, the taxes they were collecting, to provide services, many of the other services to the island. So roads, for example. Prior to the lawsuit, on Sapelo Island, the roads, vast majority of them are dirt roads, would get maintained once a year if you're lucky. So muddy roads, full of potholes, ditches overflowing. It was just a disaster, basically impassable. On the mainland, dirt roads were maintained once a week. Once a year, if you're lucky, on the island. So part of the settlement was much more frequent maintenance. EMS. If you had a medical emergency on Sapelo Island, you didn't call 911, you called the ferry boat captain and say, I have somebody who's hurt who needs to get to the mainland. Can you fire up the ferry? It's a big ferry. I mean, it holds like 150 some people, but that was the only transport. So if the ferry wasn't on the island side, you'd have to wait for it to get over and then back. So there's some awful stories about just what happened with the lack of medical services. So what is part of the settlement was a standard operating procedure, like identification of boats, like EMS and fire on the mainland. They had boats, they just didn't use them. So a procedure for how they would use boats to be able to get folks from the island to the mainland, where they would get an ambulance to the nearest medical center. Fire. Fire is an extraordinary thing, and it looks like I'm back up here, so I'm going to, I'm going to go back for a second here. So on the island, there basically was no fire protection whatsoever. So the county brought over, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, this old fire truck. It was inoperable, and before this little shed that's on top of it, it just sat on the grass. It had no working equipment. It wouldn't start. There are videos of people who actually had a bucket brigade when there was a house fire, and they had a bucket brigade with like 50 people in a row just passing buckets to get water to the fire, and it literally went right past the fire truck because it couldn't move. So we are in discussions with the county about the fact there was no firehouse or any sort of protection of the truck. And the lawyer for the county sent me a letter once saying, oh, we got a firehouse put up. And he used the word firehouse put up on the island. Oh, it's great. All right, we're making an improvement. That's the firehouse. That's Home Depot, right? I think you can get one of those at Home Depot. So a host of changes, and then a helipad there to actually, because it is so difficult to get across the water, to get somebody in a real dire emergency, actually got the county and the state to agree to work together to get a helipad there in case there had to be a life flight. And then the garbage fee, this one always sort of gets me. In a way, in all of these other issues, it feels kind of small, but it's also just so petty what the county was doing. So on the mainland, you'd get, like, probably similar to what happens here in Austin, curbside service, right? You roll your garbage container out to the road, garbage truck comes by, takes it, and goes off. That's the mainland. On the island, you'd have to load the garbage into your own vehicle, take it over to where they just had these massive dumpsters. And the dumpsters would get again, if you're lucky, emptied once a month, once every couple months. So you can imagine vermin, birds, everything else, just a nasty, nasty spot, and there's garbage strewn all over. But the amount, and it came on your tax bill, the amount you paid for garbage services on the island was exactly the same, to the penny, as what you'd get on the mainland, even though you had those extraordinary differences in the services you were actually getting. So most of those things in the settlement got improved, got some money to the families that are there, and just makes a huge difference. But we had both intentional discrimination claims and disparate impact claims. And I think there's people involved in the county where it wasn't intentional discrimination. It was just like, we don't care. We don't care about Sapelo Island. That's not a population that we really care about. And so they weren't going to provide resources to this essentially all black community on the island. So that's Sapelo Island. The fight goes on Sapelo. Right? It'll be constant, right? Because you have these pressures of the developers, and you have the pressure of people who want to have these vacation homes on the island. So it'll be a constant fight, and but we just hope they will be able to preserve. So now let me turn somewhat briefly to the Fannie Mae case. So the Fannie Mae case, right, in the wake of the 2008 housing crisis, there were a ton of foreclosures all across the country. And banks ended up with hundreds, thousands of properties on their hands that had been foreclosed on. So the banks in that situation, they have the responsibility to keep the homes maintained, market them, and eventually sell them. So a number of fair housing organizations started getting complaints that these quote-unquote REO properties were just not getting maintained in communities of color. So NAFA, with a number of fair housing organizations around the country, started doing an investigation. Let's see, is this actually accurate? These sort of anecdotal stories that we're getting of the differences in how the homes are being maintained. So they sent out investigators who would go to the properties owned by a particular bank, first in a community of color, either predominantly black or predominantly Latino, and take pictures of all of the maintenance deficiencies. So they would look at, are there holes in the walls? Is the roof maintained? Are there the windows broken out? Is there trash accumulating? They had something like 35 or so different factors that they would look at, take pictures, and then compare. Okay, for this bank in a city, let's look and see what they had in the white areas and compare it to what they had in black communities. So they end up with looking at 2,300 properties all across the country, some 38 cities, and then end up with 49,000 photographs. I got to be one of the ones who litigated the case later, so I had to deal with those 41,000 photographs. But so what did they find? So with all of those factors that they're looking at, the average number of deficiencies in a home that was 0 to 25%, this is from the complaint, to use minority because judges, that's how they operate, but really that's black or Latino communities, 0 to 25%. 4.7 deficiencies, that was the average. You go to the predominantly black or Latino communities, and the number basically comes close to double the number. And then you look at just those that had 10 or more deficiencies, again, 4 times the number of homes had 10 or more deficiencies in Black and Latino neighborhoods as compared to white neighborhoods. It's not random, right? Did the statistical analysis control for a whole host of factors? Our statisticians came in, they said yes, as I think all of us know, that's statistically significant. That's not just random, right? There is something different happening with these banks between white and black neighborhoods. Now, these are just some of the photographs of things that were happening at REO properties in black neighborhoods around the country. If you're wondering, the one on the top right, it's literally a hole from the outside into the inside of the house. That's the kind of thing, right? So what happens when this is occurring in a neighborhood, right? Property values are diminishing. And that has an effect on life outcomes, right? There's a direct link between property values and educational outcomes, health outcomes. If you're living next to these things, right, it's going to affect your health, job opportunities and outcomes, and just investment in these communities. And so these banks are, in a way, driving the disintegration of the communities by not maintaining these properties. So I should have said, so there are a whole host of banks. I think 6 or 7 banks that National Fair Housing Alliance and others investigated. Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, US Bank, Fannie Mae. So this was the Fannie Mae case. It's the first, well, it's actually the second one to resolve. Somewhat surprisingly, the case against US Bank was filed as a HUD complaint, and HUD no-caused it, which is unfortunate. Fannie Mae, we took into federal court. It settled for a total of $53 million, and 35 of that going to fair housing organizations to basically have programs, pay for programs that would stabilize these communities that have been affected by the failure to maintain and market REO properties. So an extraordinary thing, an extraordinary infusion of capital to help these communities that have just been neglected by the banks. And then Fannie Mae changed its operations, bringing more minority and women business enterprises to do the work, increase quality control. The way it worked is like Fannie Mae would own the properties, and then they would hire servicers to come in and do the maintenance. But they just didn't have the oversight, they didn't have the policies in place to ensure that it actually happened in an equitable manner. And I'm sure that different people in different places around the country, there are different reasons why these properties weren't being maintained, but it just was a pattern that repeated itself over and over again, whether you're in Los Angeles or Boston, right? You'd see the exact same thing. And then actually retrofitting a number of the properties. So again, an important resolution of the case, and at the heart of both Sapelo and Fannie is this concept of disparate impact. The idea that you don't have to prove that there was hatred toward the Black or Latino community, that there's animus, but and maybe even not even intentional actions. But they're taking actions. I think in both situations there probably was a ton of intent. But disparate impact is a way for us to say, even if the policy is neutral, it's still having this impact. But the Fifth Circuit is really, really cutting back on that. Right? So Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, those states in federal court, it's very, very difficult now to bring a disparate impact case. And that has a huge number of ramifications, right? So if the banks can get away with what they do, if the governments can get away with what they do, like on Sapelo Island, and there's no check on it, right? There's no tool, there's no remedy for the advocates to use, right? This discrimination and continuation of segregation is going to just go unchecked. I mentioned the color of law earlier. Mr. Rothstein, he published a second book, I think it's called Just Action, where he talks about what do we do about this segregation identified in my first book. And one of the things he talks about is investment in communities. And in both of these cases, that is a key thing that was being deprived of the communities, right? Investment. In Sapelo, we're not giving you any services. In fact, we're going to suck money out of you through the property tax mechanism. In Fannie Mae and all the other bank cases challenging their REOs, right? Not only are we not going to invest in your communities, but by our not investing and allowing these properties to just fall into disrepair, we're actually going to discourage others from investing. And what does that do? Rothstein has answered it. Right? It is going to maintain and perpetuate the segregation that we saw, amazing levels of segregation as we saw in those first slides. So, as I said at the start, I wanted them to be hopeful stories. Right? Those are two great resolutions of cases that have made very big differences for a lot of people, but it is a tiny, tiny drop. But at the same time, right, it is hope that these sorts of actions can be repeated and the discrimination and segregation can be slowed a bit. So that's my presentation, but there is some time for questions. So if anybody has any questions for me about these cases, those tools, or anything else, happy to answer it. Yes?
Is there a time limit as to something like this is going on?
Yeah. Great question. Basically, the question was is there a time limit? And I assume a time limit to bring a case like one of these. Yes, and a little bit of no. So the yes is, very simply, under the Fair Housing Act, you've got 1 year to file an administrative complaint with Texas Workforce Commission or HUD, and then 2 years to file a court complaint. The but is this concept of a continuing violation. Critical in both cases, really, but in particular in Sapelo. This deprivation of services had been going on for decades. And all we had to show is that it was part of a continuing policy with at least one act happening within the statute of limitations period, so within the last 2 years. And so we have brought tons of cases, and that is based on that tool, and it's a critical tool because all of this is so long-standing. And a lot of people, they don't know the discrimination is happening, or they choose, they accept the fact that discrimination is everywhere. Who am I and what can I do to challenge it? So a lot of these are old by the time they get to the Workforce Commission or to HUD or to us. Yes, sir.
So were banks discouraging private investors coming in small islands like this as well that weren't looking for recreational structures and to invest in vacation homes, that actually looking to build a community?
Banks, yeah, they weren't really playing a role one way or the other. I think banks are generally just driven by money, but they didn't take much of a role. There really was not. There are a few community groups and advocacy groups who are pushing back against the tide of development. But other than that, everybody's kind of like for development. Right? And that seemed to really be the driver, because the people with the money were the developers, and the county liked it, right? Because it was going to, right, with those fair market values going up, if developers came in, right, that would crank up property taxes, more money to the county. So the county is all for more development. Yes?
So you hear about, thank you for this, you hear about areas where ownership has been taken away, has been stolen, and I've heard some stories of some of the places, some of the original residents, some of the families, some of the generations getting that land back. Are y'all having success with that? And in this case, they were given a certain amount of money, but it didn't seem like a lot of money. So I'm like, I'm that hurts your heart, because you're thinking, did you get your land back and get you some money? I mean, tell us a little bit about that.
The primary advocate, the first time he called me about all the issues that were happening on Sapelo Island, he said, "This is about the land." And I said, "I agree." And I looked and looked and looked and really never had any super strong theory to be able to get the land back. To your question, a lot of time had passed. R.J. Reynolds had stolen the land. When he died, his wife passed it to the state. So you can't even really the current owner wasn't directly involved. But all that being said, we just filed back in January a case about the land. And the theory is in Georgia, and I think this is true in a lot of states, but definitely in Georgia, the state cannot own property in common with a private citizen. The theory is kind of simple, right? The state's supposed to be, it's got to be open. The state's got to be able to leave it public. And if you have a private entity in there, a private person who owns it, those two interests are going to almost necessarily conflict. So what happened in a lot of places on Sapelo Island, Reynolds failed to steal the land from everybody. And so there are these small interests that family members still have in some parcels. And so we're saying, hey, state, you own land with these people who still have an interest that has been passed down through generations. So state, you got to get out of there. It just started. We'll see how it goes. But there have been some successful ones, but I think it's been more where whoever owns it now has essentially been willing to give it back. I can hear you.
Well, thanks so much for all of the information. I'm interested in that second case, the no voucher policy, which it sounds like it demonstrates the rolling back of the disparate impact. I'm wondering about source of income protection, because the city of Austin passed a source of protection local law requiring all landlords to accept housing vouchers.
Yep.
The state subsequently rolled back.
Yeah.
I am wondering if we have evidence that areas that require source of income protection are in fact more integrated. Do you know if that?
I don't know the answer to that. That's a very interesting question, and could, I mean, you can only imagine what the answer has to be yes, right? Because where you see housing choice voucher discrimination, it is in predominantly white communities saying, we don't want Section 8s here, is how it's framed, right? So where it is mandated, I can only imagine, but that would increase integration. It's without that local protection, without that local source of income law, whether it be state or county or city, it's very, very difficult to challenge. And there have been a lot of failures in attempts to challenge the denial of housing choice vouchers under federal law. It just has not worked. It clearly has a disparate impact, but that the Fifth Circuit's rolling it back. That kind of thing has repeated itself across the country, even in jurisdictions with much more progressive judiciaries like New York. Same answer. They have not allowed federal challenges to refusals to accept housing choice vouchers. Anything else? Yes.
So you talked about continuing violation. Can you just speak to, I'm here in Austin, and so one of the things that we use is actually a source of income discrimination. But I would like you to speak to the fee in lieu, because that is a pattern that perpetuates segregation in our city. And it's on the agenda again for tomorrow, Plaza Saltillo, item number 36. So if you could just speak to what can the citizens do? We see the discrimination. We recognize where the area median income is. It's 80% area median income on the west side. So it's NIMBYism, but it's just disguised in a different way. So what can we, the citizens, do?
Tell me what you said, fee in lieu. Tell me what that is.
Right, so there's where there's transit, rich, robust transit, the light rail line, the commuter rail line, for example. Specifically, Plaza Saltillo is one of the stops on the commuter rail, and that's, property is actually owned by Capital Metropolitan Transportation Authority, so the Transportation Authority owns that land, but they're not wanting to put affordable housing there. So the developer has the option to pay a fee in lieu, so a couple $1 million, and then it segregates that area, and they say oftentimes, we can't make the deal work here, and then they put the lower income housing off-site, which perpetuates the segregation and the discrimination and the disparate impact that you mentioned.
Yeah. I guess I'll start by saying, look, I'm a litigator, right? So I do, I work within the confines of the laws that exist. They are super limited, and it's a battle every time. So in addition to sort of litigation, there has to be the legislative advocacy, right? There's community advocacy, there are a bunch of levels. But to get the laws to not allow something like that, because if I came in and said, in our analysis of Austin, right, this fee in lieu process is leading to affordable housing being located in predominantly black neighborhoods, I'm not getting anywhere. I just know that off right on the front end, right? Because the level of complication, the number of actors, right? They come back and say, well, no, it's the developers who are deciding to pay the fee rather than develop the housing. So for something like that, I think it is some steps away before it is a court case. At some point, there's probably a disparate impact case, or we do a lot of affordable housing cases where a jurisdiction is saying no multifamily housing or no affordable housing, or affordable housing or multifamily housing has to be located in this particular area. That's direct enough that we can bring that sort of challenge because we've got a project. We can say this is who would likely have lived in this project if in this development if it had actually been built, and can do the analysis of disparate impact. But when it's a couple steps back, where there's a program that a lot of developers are taking advantage of to not have to build affordable housing, it just becomes very, very difficult for it to be a court case. So it's more, I think, from what little I learned in your good explanation, I think that's probably more on the legislative side. It's got to be changed.
But can I just ask you, at what point do you look at the pattern or practice? Do you look at the historical context, the 1928 city plan here, and how it's east of I-35, what the area median income is there? At what point is it a court case or an administrative complaint when the pattern perpetuates itself?
Yeah, it's really case by case, but you know, like Sapelo was a struggle and seemed so obvious, right? This county has been doing the same thing. In this county, McIntosh County, there's this great book called Praying for Sheetrock that I recommend to everybody. It talks about how the sheriff sort of ran the county in a super discriminatory way going back into the 60s. And it's so obvious what was going on, but it is a struggle to get a court to accept, yeah, you might have intentional discrimination in this case. So when oftentimes it is way later than it should be a court case or administrative case because of how those doors are pretty, there's a narrow crack in those doors for us advocates to be able to get in and have a successful resolution of a case.
Thank you.
Yes, way in the back.
From the housing part of discrimination, when Ms. Cook was here, she was talking about appraisal, and she said, how many of you all know that we get directives from the lender. So if the lender is pretty much giving a guideline, so you have the lender and you have the appraiser. When someone files a complaint about discrimination, are you looking at both of those, the lender and the appraiser?
The answer to your question is yes, absolutely. So we've done a few appraisal cases, and we've sued both the appraiser and the lender. In fact, we just resolved one in Baltimore, where the appraiser came and appraised the home. I can't remember the exact numbers, like about $470,000, which was less than they had it reappraised, I don't know, 3 years before, and had done a bunch of improvements. And so this was a couple. They are both professors, and the husband, he's a professor, and his specialty is housing discrimination. So like, something's amiss here. So what they did is they did the famous whitewashing, and what Ms. Cook said, we don't accuse appraisers of whitewashing. Whitewashing is a tool like testing to see, all right, what's the difference? So they got a friend who was white come over, took all the pictures out, took all the African art off the wall, just looked like a suburban white home, and it went from 475 to I think to 750 in the appraisal. Yeah, huge. So the bank was Loan Depot, sort of an online bank, and just settled with Loan Depot. Our case is actually still going against the appraiser, but settled with Loan Depot, and they agreed to a host of changes in their procedures. One of the most important being the expanding their process for reconsideration of values. So if you see, wait a minute, this looks off, you can go to the bank, sort of skipping past the appraiser, go to the bank and say, wait a minute, I want you to take a closer look at that. So they really expanded that, and then had some new internal processes for them to see, are there patterns, are there things that look suspicious about the appraisals we're getting. But yeah, banks are critical to the process because of their role and their authority in it. Yes?
Earlier when I said, is there a time limit? What I was trying to say is this: before you could even get started with purchasing a home, you may own the property. You go to get a permit to build, and you're told that you're in a 100-year floodplain. You cannot build. Now, unfortunately, I was very young at that time, and I was like, I got to sell. I don't want to fight with this, so I ended up purchasing a mobile home in the country. And when I went back to my old neighborhood, this is where I used to live in East Austin. I lived off of Sarah Drive, and this was a block away. I noted that the city of Austin had went in and gutted out the creek and put concrete in. They were like, this area, flooding would come from the creek. And so there's houses built on that street now. And I was very upset because they said 100-year floodplain, your application was denied. And so that's what I meant by that. But I'm just sitting here thinking, that property was given to me by my parents. And so I have another opportunity, but I noted that when the taxes came out this year at 13402 FM Road 969, a part of the 16 acres that me and my siblings now inherited, they're saying it's floodplain. And I'm like, oh my God, here we go again. So I got a bigger fight this time. But I did note that people who built homes behind the property where we are, they're about as high as that from our area. It's like they just kept bringing in dirt and bringing in dirt. And now I was thinking that runoff of oil or whatever in their cars can affect the water. See, we have our own water, and it could mess up, the leasing of the water.
Yeah.
It's a lot of things that go into that, but it's east of I-35, but a lot of people are moving out on 969. But now I'm seeing, we used to call it taxation with no representation, no libraries, no stores, things like that, like a grocery store, like H-E-B. But anyway, I'm seeing that they've put a health clinic. There are schools, 3 schools within a 2-mile radius. So I'm like, Travis County's trying, but at the same token, look what's happened all this time. So now I need to talk to my siblings about this floodplain thing because I made that mistake years ago selling, but I'm not selling. Thank you. I just want to ask that question about how you deal with that.
Yeah, hard to say. It sounds like there's a lot going on there. But I think you've sort of identified a key element of sort of one of the themes of what I've been talking about is just investment in the communities. And so those communities where there is investment from the government, from private companies, right, they can thrive. It doesn't matter if it's a black community, a Latino community, a white community, Asian community, right, they can thrive. And investment is so critical and is what has been missing in black and Latino communities throughout the country since the start.
There's a lot, it's a diverse, it's black, white, anymore. I mean, there's thousands of homes that are there now. So I think it would be beneficial, like this, I just happened to be listening to KZI and I heard about this. So people are trying to call and I'm just texting them back and saying, I'm at a conference. And when I get through with giving the information I've been shared with today, it's gonna be a game changer. It
Good.
really is. Thank
Good.
you.
Good. Get out there and rouse some rabble.
I have a question.
Yes.
Someone brought up LIHTC earlier, and I know that it is a program that I guess is run out of the Treasury Department. But when we did our tour of Colony Park, one of the things that was brought out by some of the elders in the community, it's that about 20 years ago, there was a large parcel of land that the residents convinced the city to buy. And one of their concerns was that they wanted the city to buy it because they said they thought it would end up in the hands of developers that would just put more LIHTC projects in their community. And so I was wondering, are you aware of any study or anything that has looked at the impact of LIHTC within certain communities and the concentration of LIHTC and whether or not it does have a negative impact on communities of color?
I mean, it's definitely a very controversial subject, and people have very, very different views in terms of whether there's a positive or negative impact. I think one thing where most people do agree is where you have a affordable housing or even a mixed income development that is located in a area of opportunity, it thrives, right? And if you have, whether it be low-income housing tax credit projects or other affordable housing concentrated in an area, it tends to lead the governments, the stores, the businesses not to invest. So I don't know that it's necessarily the project itself, but more of the people's reaction to the project that has that sort of impact. But there's a huge, right, that's the baseline of NIMBYism, right, is you concentrate affordable housing in one area. If you do that and then there's no investment in the area, you know what's going to happen. It's not going to be successful.
So I'm from Austin, born and raised here. I grew up in the Windsor Park Mule area, and I literally went off to college in early 2000s, and I came back and my neighborhood was completely different. Like, you know, the whole situation. So I come home and I'm looking, and I'm like, Mama, what happened? You know, what's going on to the neighborhood? And so one of the situations that I know for a fact that we're dealing with is like, I'm coming back in as an advocate for housing, because a lot of the people that I grew up with, they're getting completely priced out, as we know.
Yep.
So I really feel like specifically in situations like this that it's very important for us, and you know, for us to pass this along to generations like myself, to really understand what is being challenged against us. Because one of the things that happened with my parents, why they ended up getting forced out of the home, was because they got dropped from their insurance, because they said that according to the house, it was considered a liability, and they weren't really in a position, I guess, the insurance to carry it anymore because of the upkeep of the area. And so I'm actually a residential appraiser. I'm an appraiser for WCAD. And one of the things that we've been dealing with is that I'm noticing there's not really a lot of support for people that are getting priced out in these particular areas. And so with that being said, I think the issue here kind of falls along as to, and this is my question, when we're looking at appraising discriminatory practices, when does the guideline shift from it being considered, okay, that zip code is not a desired area, to when development is starting to happen and then it becomes gentrification? So hey, let's make this a desired area to invest in. Where does that happen? Because I'm seeing a lot of that, and so when there a lot of, specifically people of color that are trying to invest in areas, they're totally like discouraged not to do so. Versus the other counterparts that's coming from the Californias, the New Yorks, the higher market value areas, they're coming in and they're buying it up. So I'm just like, when does these shifts actually happen? So that way we can actually be ahead of the curve, deal with those issues ahead of time, and then be able to address them accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everything is so intertwined. I think that's my red sign. I hadn't seen that one before. I'm out of time, but let me just say, you know, I think it is all interconnected, and then the timing part of it is super complicated. But you know, gentrification does not have to be also removal and displacement. Right. So gentrification is what gentrification is, but you know, if you have investment in those communities, you bring in stores and resources and schools and jobs, and don't displace the communities there, yes, then great, come in as an appraiser and show, you know, those values are going up without people from California, whites from California and Colorado, wherever else they come from, jacking up the prices and displacing the communities.
It's just, I think it's coming, and I'm sorry, brother, I know you got to complete your time. I think it's just where the infrastructures are connected, because they're communicating to the communities, hey, unfortunately, this house is not livable, we can't support you. And so then, therefore, my parents are being forced, insurance-wise, homeowners insurance-wise, to be like, we have to give up our home. So we're under that guise. And I think that's why it's important for us to do our research as a community as well, to know exactly what.
She told the same story over there, right? Like, I got driven out because it sounds like maybe just lied to about the floodplain. Same thing is happening, but and it's everywhere, and it's because there are populations that there are, you know, certain communities that are desired by the governments or insurance companies, and others that are not. And the segregation continues.
Thank you.
Thank you all.